Excellencies, Honorables, dignitaries, invited guests, friends and colleagues, and all protocols observed. Good morning. Welcome to Tana Forum. I'd like to thank also Frank for his frank introduction and generous sort of inviting me in here. This year we are going to focus in this Zenawi's lecture series on Winnie Mandela's legacy. Before just I say anything about that, I should just call upon who we are going to listen to on this extremely important issue. Professor Adebayo, Olukoshi, could you please come to the podium? Her Excellency, Dr. Speciosa Wandira-Kazibwe, can you just be here? Thank you so much indeed. Dr. Rahel Kassahun, can you just come to the podium once again? This way. Yes, that greeting from heart is the culture we have in Africa, so please allow them to do that one at the same time. That's one of the primary purposes of Tana Forum as well, for interaction, getting together, and also sharing together, particularly on current issues, leadership. 2017, Olusegun Obasanjo and others wrote a book entitled Making Africa Work. Its entire thesis and summary and conclusion comes to the following statement. So as to make Africa, the first thing that we have to make is make our political governance, political leadership work. Almost everything comes down to that. So this time, when we are going to discuss Meles Zenawi's lecture series, we are going to focus on that thorny issue. So far we had Meles Zenawi, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Wangari Maathai, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, and what we could gain from these people, rather than going back to Socrates, or maybe Aristotle, or East or West, Confucius or Buddha, let's look into ourselves. What have we got in Africa? That was a question, i.e., Africa's problem, for Africa problem, African solution. That being the case, this year we are going to focus particularly on tribute to Winnie Madikizela Mandela, anti-apartheid activist and politician. This year's Tana Forum theme is political dynamics in the Horn of Africa, nurturing emerging trends of peace. And that is our focus. So we have the following distinguished speakers. The first, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi. Very, very briefly, he's got a lot to share with us in the store, but he serves at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, as Regional Director for Africa and West Asia. He has more than 35 years of experience in the areas of international relations, governance, and human rights, both in the academic sector and in the international institutions. That's just simple summary. I may not go to the details. If I continue, then you might start wishing you were dead than being here. So the best way for me is to cut short and run to Her Excellency, Dr. Speciosa Wandira-Kazibwe's very quick co-chair, FemWise, and former Vice President of Uganda. Her Excellency, Dr. Speciosa Wandira-Kazibwe served as Vice President of Uganda for nearly 10 years, from 1994 to 2003. She was the first woman to hold the office of Vice President in Africa. Prior to this, she has held various cabinet portfolios, was a member of parliament, and was a member of the Constituent Assembly that drafted Uganda's 1995 constitution. I may not again go to the details, and that could just serve the purpose for this. Dr. Rahel Kassahun is a founder of African Unbound. She is by training an economist, development economist, and also she's been a lecturer at the University of California, Riverside, and she also worked for the World Bank previously before she just came to found Africa Unbound. And she's also planning to launch Pan-African Museum in a short of, if not years, maybe months or even days. We might be invited there as well, inshallah, God willing. Right. Distinguished guests, as we have already raised, this year's Meles Zenawi's lecture series is going to focus on Winnie Madikizela Mandela, as we already mentioned, to answer some of the questions. That's the leadership riddle and the problems we have in Africa. We're not going to say we're going to have all the answers from this, but what lesson do we learn? From the previous, what did we conclude was, in one sentence, behind each great leader and leadership, there was also controversies surrounding them as well, which is almost universally functional. The problem Africa faces is also common to Asia or America or Europe as well. How can we tackle, what lesson can we learn from Winnie Mandela's life? Who should speak other than Professor himself? And let me invite him. Do you prefer to be sitting there or coming here? You chose. Excellent. Please come along. You are given 25 minutes to deliver. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Master of Ceremony. Our distinguished chair for this session, former Vice President of the Republic of Uganda. I'd also like to pay homage to our former presidents who are present here with us, presidents from South Africa, from Malawi, and from the Central African Republic, Foreign Minister of Rwanda, who is also here, ambassadors, colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I think I was hoodwinked into accepting this responsibility. Let me explain. When the second Meles Zenawi lecture was going to be delivered, it was to be delivered by none other than President Thabo Mbeki. It was on Nelson Mandela. Other duties called, and President Mbeki was unable to come to Tana. I arrived in Tana. I was given a very highly unusual VIP welcome, and I was told that I was to come straight to Avani to see President Obasanjo, chair of the forum. I met him, and he asked me if I had that thing that they call iPad. And I said, yes, I have an iPad. And he said, okay, so you will take it and you will go and write something tonight that you will deliver tomorrow, because we are not going to cancel the lecture. And now I come in this morning, conscripted at the last minute. I see people who are far more better qualified, eminently so. And I'm looking at you, President Mbeki, to speak about your comrade, long-term associate. I look at Dr. Joyce Banda and others, and I begin to ask myself, what did I do wrong? Nothing? Well, I accept the challenge. And I want to accept it on the basis of a very personal experience. I think for many people of my generation, of young Africans of my generation, and perhaps even of older generations, it would be impossible to tell the story of our own upbringing and of our own growth into some form of political maturity without having had the opportunity to engage with Winnie Mandela. From a distance, in most cases, After all, very few of us were able to visit South Africa until after the release of Nelson Mandela, especially if you were not transiting from one of the Southern African states through South Africa for one reason or the other. But she was somebody whom, even when we knew her only from a distance, through what we heard and what we read and what we saw on television, we kind of felt an affinity to. An affinity that made it possible for people from different walks of life, whether it be student activists, of which I counted myself as a partisan in a northern Nigerian university, Ahmadu Bello University, or whether as trade unionists, or as civil servants, or as women activists, even as musicians. And one of the best dance music which we had in Nigeria at the time, in the 1980s, when the final battle for the soul of South Africa was joined, and the mass uprisings showed finally that the apartheid system had become untenable for one day more and was about to collapse. With all of that turbulence around us and within South Africa. Onyeka Onwenu, does that sound familiar? She wasn't really a professional musician. She was a journalist at the beginning. Waxed a record that became almost an anthem at least for us who are activists. Winnie Mandela, Mother of Africa, fighting to be free. And we danced to it as part of our own self-mobilization in solidarity for the struggles of the people of Southern Africa for liberation. Mandela was released in 1990, came on a visit to Nigeria. By then, I was no longer a student. I had taken up a career at the Institute of International Affairs. And it was the duty of the Institute to produce the foreign policy speeches of Nigerian presidents at the time. I was called upon to produce a speech to welcome Nelson Mandela to Nigeria. I think it was my first and only State House ceremony which I attended. Primarily, not really because of Nelson. It was good to see Nelson and to be able to shake hands with this great legend whom we were also tutored on in the course of our development, but particularly to see Winnie Mandela. I joined the queue, shook hands with her, standing side by side with Nelson Mandela, and said to her, "Ma, many of us, your children, have also married you many times over because you are so beautiful, inside and out. And how we wish we could actually have come to join by your side in the fight which you led for the liberation of South Africa." I think, therefore, in many respects, it is fitting that this memorial lecture for Mele Zenawi is devoted to the life and the times of Winnie. Second woman to be honored by the leadership of the Tana Forum, coming after Wangari Maathai, as you mentioned, Mr. Moderator. But somebody who I believe was eminently qualified. And as I prepared myself, I felt it may even have been very good to have had this lecture whilst she was still with us. We lost her a year ago. Because in any case, she was somebody who relished a conversation and who relished discussion and debate, particularly with a diverse group, as diverse a group as we have in this hall. But it never comes too late. Tributes have been paid to her in life and in death all over the world. And I hope that this particular occasion will go down, at least in the annals of the Tana Forum, as our own particular way of recognizing the contribution, immeasurable contribution, which she made through her life story and experience to the struggle for human freedom. And I really want to underscore human freedom, because in a certain sense, it's also not right simply to confine her to Africa. It's not right simply to confine her to the African world, because Winnie Mandela loomed large across the world. Her experience, her story, her travails, her triumphs were witnessed by all of us. There are many heroes who make their contribution quietly and are recognized by their nations and peoples for the quiet contribution which they made. But Winnie Mandela actually, like many of the leaders of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, and especially South Africa, lived her life almost like an open book which almost all of us who cared could read. There was really very little that was private about the life of Winnie Mandela. Even if she wanted privacy, the apartheid machinery was in place to monitor her around the clock anyway, as much as it did for many of the other leaders of the liberation struggle. What I propose to do, therefore, is not so much to bore you with a rehashing of her life story, as much as to draw excerpts from that experience, a life story which I believe we all are familiar with, being the open book that she was, in order to draw some lessons and conclusions, at least from my point of view, what I have found to be particularly inspirational about her story. And in doing so, perhaps a starting point which may not sound altogether natural is a reminder of ourselves that actually Winnie Mandela was just a human being. She was a human being with blood flowing through her veins like the rest of us. 22-year-old lady, freshly qualified as a social worker, goes to Johannesburg, standing at a bus stop, is spotted by a certain Nelson, is courted by him, and he was a very charming man, falls in love, gets married, looks forward to a life of quiet and family. I think it's a familiar story to all of us. But very few people and very few amongst us had such a story as we may have experienced or are hoping to experience, caught so brutally shot following the arrest, the trial, and the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and his comrades. From that moment, the story of Winnie Mandela was a changed story. And I think one of the things which is remarkable about that transition from a young lady in love looking forward to a full life ahead of her, to being at the center of a struggle for the liberation of her people and of the continent. That story in itself was a demonstration, in my view, of the kinds of quality of leadership which she embodied and which she may not even herself have realized that she had. Necessity is often said is the mother of invention. In this particular case, circumstances thrust her into a role and a function which she probably did not prepare herself for. But I also want to believe that in the making of that role, Winnie Mandela was initially, in the first instance, concerned about freeing the man whom she loved. A concern which was primordial in a natural sense, but which, in unfolding itself, also generalized into a concern for the liberation of an entire nation and people. And she rose to it with courage and with aplomb. I think it was left to many of us from our different corners of the world to watch Winnie Mandela with a mixture of sympathy or empathy. Images of her and her two girls being hounded. Images of her being driven by apartheid police into internal exile, deported from one place to the other. Evidence of torture, repeated harassment played out on our television sets, and sympathy welled up in many of us. But she never succumbed to self-pity. Rather, out of adversity, a woman was toughened, and in being toughened, she became the voice and the face within South Africa and around the world of the fight against an unjust system. The exercise of agency, the discovery of an inner strength to be able to overcome adversity is probably one of the best examples of a life of courage and fulfillment which Winnie Mandela left with us. And I draw a parallel between that experience and what many of us also see with the state of our continent, where many would easily surrender to a state of helplessness and even feel that the circumstances were so terribly bad that nothing but hopelessness would be realistic. Think of the times Mandela and his colleagues were in prison. The rest of the key leadership of the ANC had been driven underground or into exile. It was probably one of those low moments of the liberation movement where it needed to regroup and to re-strategize. And in the interim period, a struggle still needed to be fought and to be prosecuted. And the one person who managed to rise up to the occasion, even as a re-strategizing was going on, was none other than this woman who, for the sake of love, the love of her husband, was to take up a struggle which also became love of country. And she said it on many occasions, that she had become married to the struggle. It was not always obvious that when she got married to Nelson Mandela, she was very clear that she was getting married to a struggle. And in the course of that struggle, with support from inside and from outside, from the ANC within and the ANC in exile, from ordinary people of South Africa, drawing on the well of experience which she herself had quickly accumulated, including her training as a social worker, which gave her an uncommon touch with people, she was able to emerge and to emerge as the representative of the aspirations of the people of South Africa and indeed of all of Africa for freedom and dignity. Great people are often people who carry many scars with them. And I don't think in our assessment, certainly not in the stylized biographies and narratives, which often come to explain the lives of those who have had the biggest influence in shaping our consciousness and our destiny as a people. We never really hear so much about the scars which they carry. In the case of Winnie Mandela, those scars were many. She may not have betrayed them openly. She may not have been the one who would mount a podium to shed tears about being beaten or being tortured or being harassed, but rather to wave that hand of defiance and to say that the struggle has to continue. But the scars were there. Jabulo Ndebele, in his book, The Cry of Winnie Mandela, I think attempted to draw our attention to the fact that that human being also carried many pains within her. Many pains that included pains of a very personal nature that you really cannot even begin to share with many. and which not too many can fully understand, even if you try to share with them, because of their very personal nature. How can you share the pain of being separated from your husband at a youthful age with anybody? Or being left to bring up two young girls all by yourself at a time when many around you, afraid of what the apartheid machine could do, actually, even if they were sympathetic to you, learned to keep a distance in order not to get involved. And it is just one of the examples, of the many examples of the pain and of the scar which she carried through her life, and which came to define her as the years also went by. But perhaps I don't think there is any scar or pain that could have been worse than that which came up at the end of apartheid in the context of the inquiries around some of the violations that took place. I think many of us here, even though there were many who jubilated that finally Winnie Mandela had been nailed, standing in the dock for the death of Stumpy. You might remember the images. But for many, it was nothing other than the evidence of the kinds of wrong calls which some great leaders in circumstances as horrible as those which took place in South Africa in the dying days of apartheid compel on great leaders. Even if she was not directly complicit, Winnie Mandela was put on trial. From being a victim, she became, in the eyes of many, the villain. And I think of her and I say, well, this had to be the lowest moment, perhaps, for her. For a woman who devoted her entire life and sacrificed her entire being for the cause of her husband and the movement she came to grow into, to be put on trial in the context of a bitter struggle where the other side, the apartheid machinery, used everything possible to orchestrate a black-on-black violence, and in doing so, freely infiltrating spies and fifth columnists, both at home and abroad, into the leadership and even the ranks of the liberation movement, and of the mass reaction that translated into mob justice, and of the passion of the moment in which she went on that podium, on that fateful 1986 rally in Soweto, and said that the enemies within had to be necklaced. It resonated with the audience. It was to come back to haunt her at the end of apartheid. And there are those who would argue that it may not have been exactly fair to have put her on trial for the many violations that took place in the context of the anti-apartheid struggle, and certainly not to make her the biggest villain of the entire struggle, either on the side of the perpetrators or on the side of the victims. Historians will debate this for a long time to come. What I saw and what I took out of the entire episode was of a woman who may have been down again, for the second time in a dramatic way in her life that has been lived so publicly, but who was not out. And nothing better illustrated the fact that she was not out than that repeatedly she maintained a popular presence and appeal with the broad masses of the people. Never once succumbed to the temptation to seek revenge against her movement. If anything, even after divorce from Nelson Mandela, to pledge her loyalty to her organization and to the struggle which it led. what is leadership made of if it is not this kind of conviction? And that conviction is precisely what carried her into her old age. Revered as mother, even at a time when many tried to strip her of the affectionate title of Mother of the Nation. I was so very proud, sitting at the stadium in Soweto. President Mbeki and former presidents and President Cyril Ramaphosa were all there to pay tribute to her memory. And the crowds crowned her, yet again, Mother of the Nation. And I think it could have been, if she was watching, a kind of farewell that she could have wished for. Say, in spite of all of the mistakes, in spite of all errors, which leaders like her are prone to make in the heat of struggle, and there is no leader anywhere in human history, regardless of the narratives that have been spun to present the image of perfection, who actually goes through their entire experience on the basis of saintliness. And Winnie Mandela was not a saint, nor did she ever claim to be a saint. She did not shy away from controversy. She wanted controversy of the type that will help to resolve the logjam in her country. She was not afraid to speak of her own experience and to take a position on what she thought was right for her people and her country. And it is in that she inspired many, inspired so many of us, and galvanized the struggle of the people of South Africa to become perhaps one of the greatest symbols of liberation for all time. Now, to grow in the shadow of a man like Nelson Mandela. How many of you know the name of Einstein's wife? Albert Einstein? So, Winnie Mandela was part of Nelson Mandela's story, but she also had her own story, and it was a heroic story. Thank you.
Professor, thank you so very much indeed for very enlightening and empowering presentations that you've made. Before I call upon the Doctor and Her Excellency, Speciosa, I just want, Professor, for you, just if you could give us 3 points for the whole audience that I like to go with. Just 3 points, in a very summarized, succinct way, so that we can make a bridge between the previous and the current. Prof, just 3 points from, you don't have to go back, you have it already there.
I was so afraid of you that I needed to stop speaking. Well, I think the first, perhaps enduring message for all time, which Winnie embodied and which rings through for leadership to this day, perhaps a good lesson for leadership, was that sense of sacrifice, self-sacrifice. If you look at the leadership literature, people talk about servant leaders and all of the like. But it's this abnegation, the abnegation and self-sacrifice for a cause and for a people. It takes a certain inner conviction to do that. And we need a lot of it on our continent today. Secondly, is the courage and the audacity that she had with it. When Nelson was taken away, when the ANC in Tana was being decimated, it may have been expected by the authorities, the apartheid authorities, that she would be broken by that experience. She actually came out of it a tougher human being, and driving from the front with courage. There can be no leadership without courage. I think it's a lesson we need to keep in mind. We can wish the best for our continent, but manna will not fall from heaven. There has to be courage in leadership to make hard choices, but also to face off pressures of an untoward kind that seek to abridge the direction in which we seek to go. I think the third component is that connection that has to be maintained with the people. And the weakest moment of Winnie Mandela, in my view, was that moment when that connection between her and the mass of the people got ruptured. In the 80s and 90s, amidst all of the turbulence and the contestations, including the so-called black-on-black violence that was orchestrated and which triggered counter-reactions of the kind that mired her in controversy. And you might recall that she actually did say at her press conference that, but I love the people. I love the people. They are my strength. And I think this is also one of the things which leadership in our continent today must keep at the forefront. We cannot achieve transformation on the continent of the kind which we seek if the gulf between leadership and citizens remains a wide gulf. We must come down from our Olympian heights and ground with the masses.
Shall I give another round of applause, please? Wonderful. Yes, thank you so very much indeed. Self-sacrifice, courage, and of course, accountability, connection, coming down to the people. Absolutely. These are for the young leaders who are just at the back. By the way, I am going to also, without any permission from IPSS management and Secretariat of Tana there, the first thinking for us was to have a woman speaking from the very beginning, because we follow the Ethiopian and African as a whole tradition saying that Set Mala Atadam, or women have always the intuition, not only the knowledge, the wisdom as well. So we are replete with this violence. So why don't we talk to the women? Why don't we see the other dimension? They who really hold the key, not only for husbands, but for the country as a whole, not only a society, a family. So we discussed that one to be altogether female-led, but unfortunately the one who agreed previously couldn't appear, so we have to opt for another person who can play double role, professor, as you have seen already. Thank you very much indeed. So, following that line, we're going to have that alternative future, alternative thinking from women's perspective, who are loving, who are caring, who also are leading as well. Who should I call other than, of course, Her Excellency Dr. Speciosa Wandira-Kazibwe. If you want, you can be sitting there, to be honest. It is not discrimination. Oh, great. Please, as she comes here.
Thank you very much. I think I won't take much time. Your Excellencies and all colleagues and friends, I'm happy it is a man who gave the keynote address, because these days, we as women, we are struggling to find our position in society. And the men seem to be watching, but not pronouncing ourselves, except to say, oh, we have them in numbers, we have whatever. Today is about Winnie Mandela. I knew Winnie Mandela because as a young woman at the university, we knew about ANC, we knew about PSC, we knew about the liberation of Africa, we knew about the dungeons where Africans were going in Egypt, in Algeria, and we were there to be part of the struggle to make sure Africa is free. The opportunity I got to meet her in person was when I was already in government as a minister responsible for women, youth, and culture in Uganda. I was asked to host Mrs. Winnie Mandela when our father, Mandela, visited Uganda before the elections. Uganda was already on the way to ensuring women participate in decision making, and it was considered to be the number one on the continent. I had opportunity to discuss with her what she felt, what was her position as the wife of a powerful man like that. And I tell you, it shaped the way I recognized the value of marrying the right man. Because in Africa, if you want to actually achieve, either you are educated or you marry the man to give you a platform to speak. I want to tell you that when we went to Beijing in 1995, Winnie is one of the women whom we consulted on the key issues for us to take to Beijing as Africa. And she said, education and peace. And those are the two things we African women took to Beijing as an avenue to our participation into the transformation and development of Africa. I was asked to go to South Africa to discuss with the women of South Africa what their role and how they could get into that key position. I want to tell you, when you read the papers, you would imagine Winnie was actually very sectarian. She's the one who helped to identify resources to carry me from Uganda to South Africa. And here were all these women, white, yellow, and black, seated in the same room like this. And that platform came out to say, if we wait for the Constitution or the black people or ANC taking over, before we raise the issues of women participation, we would have lost the boat. So I really want to pay tribute to Winnie Mandela as a mentor of women leaders, and having been there with the Mandelas, with the Mugabes, with the Nyereres at the African Union, I knew that there was a woman who was fighting a war, because it continues to be a war. Africa is continuing to fight for her emancipation. And we as women, we want to say that without Winnie Mandela and the likes of Winnie Mandela, we wouldn't have the courage to keep standing and reminding you of where we should go in our struggle to emancipate Africa. So the value of education, education of the girl child, should continue to be on the horizon without Winnie being educated by her parents. And the fact that she stood out because she spoke with information and knowledge, Mandela wouldn't have noticed her. The new generation keeps saying, you should not marry an uneducated woman. She's a burden. If Winnie had not been educated, and when Mandela was to go to Robben Island for all those years, the name of Mandela would have died. I want to say this, because there were other men in the struggle in South Africa who were ready to take on everybody so that we could move forward. The value of partnership. I want to say to the young women here and the young men who are not yet married, do not force women in Africa to change their names, because that is the root of who we are. That is what will make us who we are. And I'm glad Winnie kept her middle name, Madikizela, because later on there was another Mrs. Mandela.
That's right.
Finally, you've given me a red card. This son of mine who spoke before me took up all our time. Finally, I want to say this, that being at the top there as a woman is not easy. And that is what happened to Winnie Mandela. We see the women. Look at Joyce Banda. What happened to her? Look at Madame Samba Panza. She's the only woman who was interim and asked not to stand again to be president. Which man would accept that? We would like everybody, and the young men and women here, because we are going into an era of partnership, Winnie was Mandela's partner. She was not behind him. She was up there when South Africa needed her. She was there for us as women when we needed her to help us in whatever issues we needed to put forward. So I want to salute my sister, because if you are a Christian or believe in God, the spirits are always there. And that I would like to really say that while we have many Mandelas across Africa, you, the young women who can still give birth to daughters, have Madikizela all over Africa. I thank you very much.
Can't thank you enough indeed. Excellent, including time use. That's why we're talking about going back to women, even for intuition. That's what we discussed with Michelle, who I think I can't see her now here, must be very busy as always, multitasked. And then, if we also turn back to just at least 1 or 2 points that these people must go with. You told the young women not to change their names. There could be a possibility of having another one. And also there are so many other exciting points, but at least 2 points that everyone should buy into. How about the males? They all are your children. So how would you advise your boys as well? You girls, all right, fine, now they're ready. Just 2 points.
My 2 points: educate the girl child. Educate her, educate her, educate her, and it's not only about going to school, but make her whole so that she believes in herself. That is the example the parents of Winnie Madikizela Mandela did for us. Secondly, what Winnie showed us is that you don't wait for things to come to you. Go for them. I want the women of Africa to go for it. These men here will not make way for us. It's an issue of power. And Winnie took that position and held on to it despite all the issues. And she stayed up there. Those are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you so very much again. Dr. Rahel, if you like, you can.
May I?
Sure, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to speak about a very honorable woman, and to the speakers, to the 2 speakers who spoke before me, Bayo and Dr. Speciosa, thank you so much. You told a beautiful story about her, and we need to. I want to start my comments by saying. We've always talked about shaping Africa's narrative. We talk about we Africans need to shape our narrative. And I think that starts at the individual level. We have to, who is Winnie Mandela to you? We should read about her. We should interview the people who knew her. Unfortunately, I don't have a personal story to tell about her. I didn't have the great fortune of meeting her. But we have to inform ourselves, and we need to know our heroes and our legends and our leaders, so we can tell a balanced story, so we can know and learn from their experiences. 400 days in solitary confinement. How would that impact you? How would that change your personality or your worldview? We should ask ourselves that question. We read, after her passing, we read stories about her being an angry, bitter, unforgiving woman. Why wouldn't she be? I mean, if she was that, she went through so much. She was under constant, unrelenting harassment. She was violated, tortured, been through so many. Bayo, you talked about her scars. she lived a very, very difficult life. But I think what I want to emphasize here is that we need to tell the stories of our leaders, of our heroes. We need to take the time to know them, to understand them, because when we do that, we're creating space for emerging leaders, for young leaders to rise and shine and make their contributions to the society, particularly at a time when we look around in the world now, and including Africa, there are a lot of leaders. We see so many of them very egotistical and in positions of power to serve for their own self, to ease their sense of powerlessness, and to just, for nothing bigger than themselves. We see we have to honor the likes of Winnie Mandela, who gave so much of herself. And all of it was to uplift, make a difference for the people of South African society, and to end that very oppressive system that dehumanized the South African people. So I'll end my comments there. I promised that I would make mine short. Thank you very much.
Right. We, of course, recognize our former leaders here, South African, Malawi, many other leaders are. Also, we have the African chair, AUC chair as well here. And so this kind of forum is really informal, where the leaders and led come together. They don't spend time on excellencies, dignitaries, and those portfolios and those all intricacies into formalities. So it's time for us now to make comments and ask questions. If we are to ask questions, our questions should end with question mark, so that others can answer it very quickly. And if we are to make comments, they should not exceed at least 2 minutes indeed. But I'll give priority first to the front line here. Let me start with, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Joyce Banda, former president of Malawi. I wanted to say one thing. First, I want all of us to remember that it was Winnie Mandela who kept the fire burning. President Nelson Mandela was not alone at Robben Island. But this is one woman, as some of us were growing up, who kept the world aware about her husband's situation and fought for his release. I wanted to put that on record. Number two, I was very fortunate that I was able to speak on behalf of SADC when I was chair of SADC at the funeral of President Mandela. In that speech, I recognized Winnie Mandela's role. And from there onwards, she looked for me, and we became very close towards the end of her life. I was able to speak with her and to ask her and to get to listen to her about what she went through, especially what my sister there talked about, the 400 plus days in solitary confinement, the torture that she went through. And I asked her, how were you able to endure such pain inflicted on you for so long? And she said the best times are when I collapsed. When I fainted, then I was fine, because I didn't know what else they were doing to me. I say this because I want us to feel, because in the end, the picture that was painted in South Africa about Winnie Mandela is not the actual picture that has remained with most, especially young people, who don't know exactly what she went through. I want to ask us all, particularly those of us that are women champions on the continent, to take up this task as a project, to research further, because the week that we were mourning Winnie Mandela, 2 most senior members of that government, one of them head of the police, actually came out on television and confessed that some of the evidence against Winnie was made up. We cooked that up. And some of the negative publicity she got. This other white leader in South Africa actually said, sometimes we just followed her to a restaurant where she was having a meal with her children. Take a photo, if she leaves a glass of wine, the next day headlines was that she was motherlessly drunk. So issues like those need to be corrected. The narrative needs to change. I was saddened because I spent that week in South Africa and most young people did not know that part of the fight that Winnie Mandela put up so gallantly, because all they were told were the next negative stuff at the end. This is an appeal to women leaders. Nobody else is going to do it for us in a patriarchal society like ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Right. Now we've got, okay, I can see there 1, 2, 1, 2.
Thank you very much. It is not easy to produce a balanced narrative on lady who is controversial as Madikizela Mandela, actually. She's a controversial lady, wasn't she? Well, my little reading of her at least reminds me of two things. One, at least with the verdict of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, she was morally and politically accountable for the illegal practice that was used with the Mandela's United Football Club, resulting, of course, in the kidnapping of Skopi Sepai. Well, that should always be on record. I know. I like your positive reflections, but as one of the speakers said, a balanced report is always not easy. And I have noticed the difficulty in the presentations that you have encountered, actually. Second, Winnie was alone when she was around her death, actually. The ANC is a party which has really fought hard. But do you think that the ANC was there during her hard times, actually?
Thank you, Marha.
Thank you
very much indeed. Very well done. Now to Hannah. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to share
That's
that.
the last question.
Yes. When I was growing up in Sweden, in diaspora, it was actually the images of Winnie Mandela that really awakened my political and social consciousness, and that of so many others, boys, girls, women, and men. So she was a true icon in the truest sense of the word. And yes, she grew into a leader, but I also see in her a woman who was born a leader to the extent that one can have innate leadership qualities. So a question keeps ringing in my head, especially from Professor Adebayo's beautiful exploration of her life. Could Winnie not have been Winnie, this icon, this leader, without Nelson Mandela? Were her political convictions, at least the genesis of them, were they also not formed apart and before Nelson Mandela's arrival in her life?
Thank you very much indeed. 2 minutes each.
My first minute is to the gentleman, because I didn't see his face, who talked about the Stompy case. And I have this to say. At the time, in my opinion, because I'm not a student of political science, a practitioner of ETS, I knew that what was going on in South Africa is to try to balance the atrocities of the apartheid regime and compare them with what the ANC or its operatives could do. So to me, it was a comparative study. And when I weighted it, certainly, as a leader, knowing what goes on all over the world, there is no man who has been president of a country or leader of a party who has been put to book the way Winnie Mandela was in her own community for crimes that were related to fighting for the freedom of the people. In a tribe in my country, we say ensi egula mirambo, meaning that if it is on the blood of those people who care for everyone that we are actually planting the seeds for the future. Finally, I want to say that when everything is said and done, women do have a special role to play in leadership, different from the men. And I wrote that down so that I don't speak for a long time. The most important legacy of a woman in leadership, to me, and it was shown by Winnie Mandela, is the ability to impart to the children we nurture, including the men who lead us, because they are all our children, the resilience for the common good, ensuring that the tenacity to ensure your own survival as a cultural being, as a creation of God in your diversity, is kept going. And I think this is where young girls like the one who spoke there will continue to nurture Africa into the leadership that we need for tomorrow. I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I very much recognize your observation, President Banda, with regard to the need for us to continue research in order to correct narratives about many of our leaders. Narratives that were told about Winnie Mandela are not too dissimilar to narratives you would hear about Kwame Nkrumah, for example. Some of the things that Kwame Nkrumah was alleged to have done, and when the declassification of documents takes place 25 years after in the United States and in the UK, you begin to see a different story behind the story. And not to talk of the confessions, which you referred to. And I think much still needs to be done about what happened in the 80s, leading to the release of Nelson Mandela and freedom in 1994. Much still needs to come out, which cannot come out yet, which will probably not come out for yet a while, that we would need to take into account. But even on the basis of what we know, and this goes to the second observation that was made, even on the basis of what we know, I think it is fair to say that there is no successful leadership that leaves a lasting imprint anywhere in human history that does not have controversy with it. So why would the wrong calls, as I put it in the paper, that Winnie may have made or did make result in a wholesale destruction of a legacy and of a contribution? And I think this is the issue. I don't think I hedged, really, in terms of my own assessment. The world witnessed an uncommon heroine in Winnie Mandela. She made a contribution that was unambiguous, not just to freedom in her country and on our continent. I place her in the pantheon of some of the best freedom fighters the world has seen. And the evidence is there. I mean, 90% of us would have been broken, completely broken, by half of what she went through. And, you know, not much effort was left in trying to entice her to betray the ANC and to betray Nelson Mandela. These are all documented. So I think it's important for us to keep it in mind. I had a counterfactual in the paper, actually, also, when you read the paper. My counterfactual was, which is not too dissimilar to yours, what would have happened if she became a collaborator of the apartheid regime? What would have happened? And I think it helps us, even if there can be other counterfactuals to my counterfactual and your counterfactual, Let me just end this sentence, please. Even if there could be many other counterfactuals to your counterfactual and mine, the truth of the matter is that those questions help us to place in perspective the immensity of the sacrifice she made in standing tall and holding the course against all adversity. And I think for me, that is where the narrative has to begin.
Thank you. Wonderful lead. Thank you. Finally, yes,
Just very quickly to add to what has been said already, I'll address Hannah's question about would Winnie Madikizela have been Winnie Mandela, the Winnie we know now, without Nelson Mandela. My feeling is, I think when Nelson Mandela met her and fell in love with her and chose to marry her, he must have sensed that there is this fighter, this courage, this woman who embodies tremendous courage, intelligence, dedication, honor. He must have sensed that beyond the beautiful face, of course. He must have sensed that that was there and that she would be a good partner to him. I'm not going to talk about counterfactual. You've addressed that, so yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, all the presenters to us. And I also like to thank you very much for the civil discourse you maintained, which is foundation for democracy. And at the same time, do 99 things good and do just one thing, a slap of mind. You'll be remembered for that one thing rather than 99 those good things, to be honest. Unfortunately, that's in our human nature as well. But there is a lesson for us to learn from this lecture series. It is just to continue to provoke your thoughts, to continue to enter into conversation. That's the main point. So I'd like to thank you so very much for very active participation. At the same time, I'm going to give you some piece of information given to me from the organizers. You've got about 15 minutes break outside before you go to the next discussion and lecture. So thank you so very much. Let's continue our spirit of Tana outside and networking. God bless you abundantly and goodbye.